The Atlantis Paradise Island resort in the Bahamas is not a hotel in the conventional sense that any previous case file in this channel's archive has examined. It is a themed environment, a constructed mythology of an imaginary lost civilization expressed in concrete, coral, and water, spread across 141 acres on Paradise Island with 11 hotels, a casino, a water park, an aquarium containing more than 50,000 sea creatures, and a conference center designed to accommodate events of a scale that most American cities cannot rival. The original hotel towers were built by Merv Griffin in the 1990s. Saul Kerzner, the South African resort developer who had built Sun City in apartheid-era South Africa, acquired the property and transformed it into the Atlantis brand that the global travel industry now recognizes as one of the most successful resort destinations in the Caribbean. It has also been one of the most consistently refinanced resort assets in the Western Hemisphere, a property whose extraordinary commercial success has paradoxically made it more indebted rather than less over the course of its operating history. Because the same brand authority that generates the revenue that services the debt also generates the borrowing capacity that has been used to add more debt as each successive expansion has been financed at costs that the resort's revenue growth has been required to chase rather than to outpace. The forensic entry point for this case is the relationship between resort complexity and financial complexity, because the two have grown in parallel at Atlantis in a way that this channel's previous 16 case files have not documented at comparable scale. Every other case file in this archive has examined an asset that was financially compromised by a single catastrophic transaction or a single period of governance failure. Atlantis has been financially compromised by its own success, by the mechanism through which a resort that was generating genuine commercial returns at every stage of its development was able to use those returns as collateral for borrowing that consistently exceeded the rate at which the returns themselves were growing. The Atlantis case is not the story of a fantasy that failed. It is the story of a fantasy that succeeded commercially and was leveraged financially in a way that made the commercial success insufficient to retire the debt the fantasy required. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now. Because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. Kerzner International, the development entity that built the Atlantis brand at Paradise Island, financed successive phases of the resort's expansion through a combination of project financing, corporate debt, and sovereign relationships with the Bahamian government that produced a capital structure of exceptional complexity by the time the resort had reached its full physical development in the mid-2000s. The financing structure for each expansion phase was predicated on the revenue generation of the previous phase, creating a sequential dependency in which each new tranche of debt required the resort to perform at a level that the previous tranche's repayment schedule had already established as the minimum acceptable outcome. The covenant that nobody read carefully enough was the one embedded in that sequential dependency, the assumption that each phase of the resort's commercial expansion would generate enough incremental revenue to service both its own financing costs and the accumulated debt service obligations of all previous phases simultaneously. That assumption was coherent in a market environment where the Caribbean luxury travel market was expanding and where Atlantis's brand position within that market was strengthening. It was not coherent in a market environment where the 2008 global financial crisis eliminated the discretionary luxury travel spending that the resort's revenue model depended on, simultaneously reducing occupancy, casino revenue, and the retail and food and beverage ancillary revenues that the resort's complex operating model required to maintain its aggregate debt service coverage. The specific covenant failures that emerged from the 2008 and 2009 operating period at Atlantis were not the dramatic single event defaults documented in the Fontainebleau and Trump Taj Mahal case files. They were a gradual deterioration of debt service coverage ratios across multiple facilities simultaneously, producing a negotiated restructuring process with the resort's lender group that extended over several years and that required Kerzner International to bring in a strategic equity partner with sufficient capital to recapitalize the resort's balance sheet without triggering the formal default mechanisms that the covenant structure specified. Brookfield Asset Management acquired a controlling interest in Atlantis in 2012 through a transaction that valued the resort at a figure that reflected the post-crisis compression of Caribbean luxury hospitality valuations, and that established a new debt basis for the asset at a level below the peak obligations that the Kerzner-era expansion financing had accumulated. The covenant failures were resolved without a Chapter 11 proceeding. The resolution required transferring control of a resort that its original developer had built from nothing to an institutional asset manager whose relationship with the property was financial rather than creative. At what point does a resort developer's creative vision become a liability for the financial structure that funded it? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The appraisal methodology applied to successive phases of Atlantis's expansion financing shared the foundational limitation that this channel has documented across 16 case files. The treatment of stabilized revenue projections derived from peak cycle market conditions as a reliable baseline for debt sizing in a market whose cyclical characteristics made that baseline inherently unstable. The Atlantis case adds a specific complication that the previous 16 case files have not documented: the appraisal of a themed resort asset whose revenue is generated not by a single hospitality product, but by a complex ecosystem of interconnected revenue streams, each of which was projected to grow in parallel with the others, and each of which was modeled as partially independent of the cyclical pressures that affected conventional hotel room revenue. That modeling assumption was not unreasonable. Atlantis had demonstrated, through its operating history, that its revenue diversification across rooms, casino, water park, retail, food and beverage, and conference business provided a degree of cyclical resilience that a single product hotel did not possess. The diversification argument was correct in the direction it pointed. Atlantis did perform better than a single product hotel would have in the 2008 and 2009 downturn. The diversification argument was incorrect in the magnitude it implied. The resilience of the diversified model was sufficient to reduce the severity of the revenue decline relative to a single product hotel, but not sufficient to maintain the aggregate debt service coverage that the cumulative financing structure required. The appraisal error was not in the identification of the revenue diversification benefit. It was in the calibration of that benefit as a percentage of the debt service coverage cushion that each successive financing phase could safely provide. The resort's lenders and advisors had modeled the diversification benefit as providing protection against a moderate cyclical downturn. The 2008 financial crisis was not a moderate cyclical downturn. It was a severe global demand shock that reduced luxury travel spending at rates that the diversification benefit attenuated, but did not neutralize. The gap between the attenuated decline that the diversification actually produced and the neutralized decline that the appraisal had modeled as the stress scenario is the forensic finding at the center of the Atlantis appraisal analysis, a model that was directionally correct and quantitatively inadequate, a combination that is in some respects more dangerous than a model that is simply wrong, because it provides sufficient confidence to support lending decisions that a clearly wrong model would not. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. Kerzner International's response to the deteriorating debt service coverage ratios of 2008 and 2009 reflected a pattern that this channel has documented in multiple case files, but that took a specific form at Atlantis that deserves forensic attention. The denial was not public-facing in the manner of the Trump Taj Mahal case, where the developer made affirmative public assertions about the project's viability in the face of regulatory data that contradicted those assertions. It was structural and private, embedded in the negotiating posture that Kerzner International adopted toward its lender group in the restructuring discussions that followed the recognition that the debt service coverage ratios were unsustainable. The structural denial at Atlantis consisted of the assertion, maintained through multiple rounds of lender negotiation, that the resort's underlying commercial performance was sufficiently strong to support a restructured debt facility without requiring the equity recapitalization that the lender group was demanding as the price of covenant waiver and maturity extension. That assertion was not entirely wrong. Atlantis was generating genuine revenue at levels that no comparable Caribbean resort could match, and the resort's brand authority and competitive position were, by any reasonable assessment, durable competitive advantages that justified a premium valuation relative to the distressed market conditions of 2009 and 2010. The assertion was insufficient because the lender group had correctly identified that the resort's revenue generation, while impressive in absolute terms, was not growing fast enough relative to the accumulated debt service obligations to produce the coverage ratios that the covenant structures required without a reduction in the principal balance of the outstanding debt. Kerzner International's negotiating posture treated the resort's commercial strength as a substitute for the equity recapitalization that the balance sheet required. The lender group treated the commercial strength as a reason to demand equity recapitalization at a valuation that reflected the resort's genuine earning power rather than its distressed circumstance. Brookfield's acquisition of controlling interest in 2012 resolved the impasse by providing the equity capital that the lender group required at a valuation that Kerzner International accepted as preferable to the alternative of formal default proceedings. The creative vision that had built one of the world's most recognizable resort destinations was transferred to an institutional asset manager in exchange for the balance sheet recapitalization that the vision's financing structure had made necessary. Brookfield Asset Management's stewardship of Atlantis since 2012 has produced a period of operational stability and physical investment that the Kerzner-era expansion financing had made structurally difficult to sustain. The resort has continued to operate as one of the most commercially successful destinations in the Caribbean under Brookfield's ownership, generating revenue that services the recapitalized debt structure while funding the ongoing capital investment that a physical plant of Atlantis's scale and complexity requires. The water park is maintained. The aquarium is maintained. The casino operates. The hotels are occupied at rates that the Caribbean luxury market recognizes as exceptional. The Atlantis case occupies a specific position in this channel's archive that no previous case file has filled. It is the only case in the 16-episode collection in which the asset that failed financially was not a conventional hospitality product but a constructed mythology, a physical environment built around a narrative of a lost civilization that had no analog in the existing hospitality market and whose commercial success was therefore not predictable from the operating history of any comparable asset. The appraisal methodology that financed successive phases of its expansion was building projections for an asset category that did not exist in the historical data that appraisal models use as their primary input. That absence of comparable data is not unique to Atlantis. Every genuinely innovative hospitality product faces the same appraisal challenge. The models that determine how much debt the project can support are calibrated to the performance of assets that preceded it, and the assets that preceded it were not designed to do what the innovative product is designed to do. The Atlantis case demonstrates that the financing of innovation in hospitality is structurally predisposed to overleverage, because the revenue projections that justify the debt must be built on assumptions that the market has not yet validated, and that the appraisal methodology has no reliable tool for calibrating against historical data. The lost civilization at the bottom of the aquarium was never real. The debt that financed the building that contains it was. Brookfield manages one. The Bahamian economy depends on both. The mythology survived. The capital structure that created it did not survive in its original form, which is, in the forensic framework of this channel, the expected outcome when fantasy is financed at scale. If this case file changed how you evaluate the financing of genuinely innovative hospitality products, subscribe to this channel, because the next case examines what happens when the innovation is architectural other than conceptual, and the market decides it prefers the concept to the building. And in the comments, given Atlantis's documented revenue diversification across rooms, casino, water park, retail, and conference business. What specific debt service coverage covenant structure would have adequately modeled the aggregate stress scenario that 2008 produced? The case file is open.